You're listening to the Primal Happiness Show, a podcast dedicated to helping you thrive in this crazy modern world. Every Tuesday, we explore the nature of how our minds really work, what exactly the human animal requires to thrive, and how we can live happier and more fulfilling lives. If you're new here and haven't yet taken our free class, then there's no better place to get a jump start on reclaiming your primal happiness. It's where we'll guide you step by step through our antidote to today's modern world. Simply head on over to primalhappiness.co/antidote to get the free class and discover how to thrive without having to move to a planet that's not so crazy as ours. But now, your host, Leanne Brook-Tyler.
Hello, my beautiful people. A huge warm welcome back to the show. In today's crazy modern world, men and women are living shallow, disconnected, and unfulfilling lives. So we created the path for those who are ready to reclaim their wildness and actualize their deepest gifts. We have just filled the last place in Waking Wild Medicine, which starts in January. And oh my goodness, we cannot wait. What an amazing group of people. It is going to be quite something, that 6-month journey we're going to take together. If you missed out on that opportunity, we will certainly be creating more crucibles, more ways you can wake the wild in 2021. If you'd like to keep up to date with that, then you can check out our Go Deeper page, which is at primalhappiness.co/go deeper. Or come join our Facebook group. I mean, the real bonus of that is you really get to be part of an amazing community of like-minded people. It's really touched me lately to really see those connections starting to grow between people. So if you're not in the group, come join us, completely free. And that's at facebook.com/group/primalhappiness. And now onto this week's show. It's with Tim Corcoran. He is the founder of Purpose Mountain, where he offers nature-based purpose guidance to support people with a love for wild nature who feel a deep yearning and burning desire to discover their purpose. Tim is a leader of men's groups, holistic rites of passage for boys and men, and wilderness vision quests. Healing the cultural rift between the mainstream and Indigenous cultures, transformational consciousness work, the spiritual journey, ancestral work, deep nature connection, family and health are all deep commitments in his life. In this show, we spoke about how we can find our purpose via our connection to the wild. Tim also explains so beautifully why the wild is so powerfully activating to humans in this way. Oh, this is such a gorgeous show. Can't wait to share this one with you. Let's dive in. Hello, Tim. A huge welcome to the show.
Thank you, Leanne. Great to be here.
Oh, I am really excited about this.
Yes.
we took a little while trying to decide on topic because there was just so many things we could talk about, and I think we picked the juiciest one. But we already said it might be we have to do a part 2 just to get into all the things that we potentially could. But today we are talking about a topic very dear to mine and Jonathan's hearts, which is this, I guess, using the wild as a portal for purpose, which, I think couldn't be a better topic to talk about. What got you into this work, this beautiful work? What brought you here?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I've been working with nature and purpose and facilitating that journey of helping people connect with nature and purpose really for my entire adult life. So for me, it goes back to boyhood. You know, I'm 46. I was raised here in the States, in the Midwest, in Indiana, which with a very, rural upbringing. And, it was the 80s. So we didn't have a lot of TV shows or whatnot. And most of my childhood was just spent outside, immersing in nature. And as a sensitive boy, I was very emotionally and spiritually sensitive, I think, Leanne. And I was always contemplating the mysteries of life. Why are we here? Why am I here? Why are you here? What is the meaning of all of this? I had some early experiences where my dad took us out west to the Colorado Rockies, and we saw the Grand Canyon and some of the amazing landscapes of the American West that really did something to my soul. And right in there was a deep fascination with Indigenous culture, with Native American culture. I wasn't exposed to much of that early on, but it was like a calling or something deep within. Well, fast forward, and when I finished college, I decided that, I had played by the rules and I was ready to now live life by my rules.
Ooh,
so I took a very
lovely.
non-standard approach, and I packed everything in my truck. I drove 40 hours nonstop out west, and I had one friend on the Navajo Indian reservation. And I made a life for myself there. Spent 2 years living with the Navajo Indians. Had a whole wild journey that unfolded there that eventually led me to connect with, Janine, who's now my wife. And as well, we wound up after a couple of years there. It was a beautiful experience of immersing in this culture, but I found it difficult to find individuals who had traditional connection with the old ways, and B, those who did. It was very, very difficult to find those who were willing to share, especially to a white guy, right? And so I made some deep connections, and there's a whole other story there I won't get into, but we made a shift, and I wound up moving up to Oregon to be with my wife, and at that point, we started. We got involved with found a school that was teaching how to connect deeply with the land, with the natural world, and it was very practical, right? It was very feet on the ground, things like studying, wild plants that you can eat, and medicinals, wildlife tracking, wilderness survival skills, but not so much from the sense of preparing for the end of the world or something, but from the sense of making a deep connection to the natural world through providing for oneself, right? And for me, as a young man in my early 20s, that spoke to something powerful. Like, why is it that I am dependent on grocery stores and roadways and telecommunication systems just to live, right? Just to eat, just to have a home. And so the archetypal journey of wilderness survival was really spoke deeply to my soul. And so those were kind of the early beginnings. It was the journey of connecting with nature in that sense, like providing for myself and taking self-responsibility, as well as the spiritual side of got met, which was where I was introduced to this concept of the vision quest and this idea that life is not random, that I'm here for a reason and you are too. And the great adventure of life is to discover, what is that reason? Why am I here? And how in the heck do I go about living that and expressing that in the world? And so when I saw that, wow, this is still a possibility and you could actually go do this, I went for it, jumped in all with 2 feet. So long story short, my wife and I got involved with a wilderness school that was very much community-based. When people hear that wilderness school, they think, oftentimes I think people think of the hard skills and, man versus wild or something. But my experience was not like that. It was very much about a balance and attuning to the natural world and finding how that is reflected inside of myself. And so, and mentoring and building community, right? If we're looking at nature, then we're looking at community. And if we're looking at community, then we're looking at how do community relationships unfold. So I know I'm dropping a lot of juicy topics here, but these were kind of some of those early influential moments. And so those were some of the big threads, right? The spiritual connection to nature through some old ceremonies. We were really blessed, Leanne. I was really blessed to have the opportunity to connect with a handful of traditional Native American elders that were working as teachers with this wilderness school.
Goodness.
And so we had the opportunity to make deep relationships there that wound up being very, very impactful on my journey. But long story short, we did 5 years immersing at this school, training. I mean, it was like a master's, PhD level of nature connection. and mentoring training and spiritual development in the natural world based on the old ways. And that was 15 years ago. And when that wrapped up and through the spiritual calling that I experienced with the power of the Vision Quest, we wound up moving out to Idaho, where I live now, and we started our own wilderness school. So that was 15 years ago. And then about 5 years ago, I shifted gears. So we still run the wilderness school. And about 5 years ago, I shifted gears and I started my second organization, which is Purpose Mountain, where I focus explicitly on connecting people to their spiritual purpose using a nature-based approach. Now, that's kind of the opposite of the wilderness school. The wilderness school is all about connecting people to nature, and the purpose definitely comes, but it's like a side effect, if you will, and it's not so much the initial intention. The wilderness school is just about connecting straight up with nature. So that's a quick overview of my story. But yeah.
Oh, it's enchanting. So what a delightful story. It's what's fascinated me is how you clearly had a sense of a calling right back at that point where you left college and then went straight to the reservation. Yep. What was that? Like, how did you, if you can name that now, what do you think was that?
Well, again, I mean, I think it was a couple of things. One was that what I've discovered about myself is that as I was mentioning, I've always been very sensitive, I think, emotionally and spiritually. And that comes with benefits and drawbacks. That was no fun in the locker room being a boy, in grade school. But now I see that as a tremendous gift. And so when I look back, the other thing that this really ties into is trauma, right? So on the one hand, I had a really wholesome, loving childhood, a wonderful family, good friends, lots of connection to nature, as I said. But there were some unfortunate sides as well. I faced trauma in a couple of different areas of my life: bullying at school, divorce, and some abuse early on. And so by the time I got to college, Leanne, I was looking at, I've always done this. I was just looking at the structure of our society, and I was just like, this is a joke. Like, look where it's gotten me. Look where it's gotten my family. There's a lot of pain and suffering that has come out of that, not just for me, but for others. And I intuitively knew. I just knew. I was like, this is not a sustainable approach. Look what we're doing to the earth. It was 1996. So dating myself a bit here, but it was clear to me that we were not on a healthy path as a culture, for a society, for the earth. And I wanted to make a difference. I just felt in my heart of hearts, Leanne, like I have a responsibility. I'm a human being on this planet. I didn't know, I had really low self-esteem at the time, so I didn't know what I could do, but I knew I had to do something. And I knew that I wanted to stay in alignment with myself, where I was feeling fully alive, right? Like, I remember, I don't know if you remember this, I'm sure some of our listeners do, but I remember being a kid and being so full of life, right? Like every day was a new adventure. There's always some novel, exciting new thing to do. And I'm learning and growing and I'm engaging in life. And that was my purpose as a boy, right? And I remember looking around at the adults around me like they were all zombies, like they were all sleepwalking. And I was like, what is this? Is that the fate that awaits me? No way. And so I knew, I said, if I walk the regular path, if I go get the job in the cubicle and climb the corporate ladder or whatever it is, that's going to lead nowhere really, really fast for me. And I just, so it was it was mystical. It was mythical. It was my soul's calling. And it was just my, I think, straight up passion to live a full life and to make life an adventure. And so, it was scary. It was definitely vulnerable, but, to go out there. I mean, I remember, I'm a white male living in America, right? Like I'm a very privileged individual without doing anything. And so to move out there and be the minority all of a sudden, be the one of 2 or 3 white folks amongst, thousands of indigenous people, that was really different, But yeah, to answer your question, I think it was, I think it was a response to everything that didn't work in childhood, and really this yearning to create something better for myself and for the world.
Yeah, wow, I really hear that. You've called to mind a conversation I had with a podcast guest a couple of weeks ago. And the work she does is so unusual. It's a kind of blend of sound therapy, but then also kind of how that can be displayed visually. And looking also at kind of ancient ways, symbols and things like that, like sacred geometry and
beautiful.
I guess sort of symbols you might get in temples, and how the two things relate and how they have a kind of profound effect on a human looking at these images that are kind of sound almost crystallized in an image. Really, and she's invented a whole sort of technology and all sorts around this. So like really out there in terms of like, that's not a mainstream thing. She happened to just drop in that she was telling a bit about her childhood and how she can now look back and see how those two ideas of kind of symbolism and sound were actually like present in her childhood. And she just happened to drop in that she thinks that quite often we can really see the seeds of our soul purpose in our childhood experiences. And I've often, because I've spoken to so many people for the podcast, and quite often they are doing things that are quite unusual, and often you can see those roots right back in childhood. Just briefly, I can see the same in my own childhood. I had a very wild, I suppose you could say, childhood myself. I was very fortunate in that I had a very adventurous father, and we spent several years just traveling around Europe, Morocco, literally under the stars, and often living quite hand to mouth. And I look back and I think, it's like I had unlike you, I didn't have the sensitivity to know to go directly there. I kind of did the corporate stint first, which I don't regret. I think in some ways that was needed. That was part of my path. But I now look at the work I do and I go, like there it was, you're liberating myself and helping others to liberate themselves into the wildness of who they really are. Makes so much sense now when I look back at my childhood. So I love the way your story just gorgeous. So I'm going to ask you a question. It's going to sound really stupid, but I trust that when I ask these questions, like what ends up coming back when I ask these seemingly stupid questions is always gold. So forgive me if I sound stupid.
No problem.
Why do you think that there is this, let's say, revelation available about our soul purpose in the connection with the wild? Why would that be? What do you see would be the reason for that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Leanne. And I think it's a really important question that we ask right now, especially when we look around the world and look at the state of the world, right? But so first off, and I'm sure this will resonate with you and probably most of our listeners, first off, we are nature, right? When I run programs, I often get people coming to me saying, "Oh, Tim, I can't wait to come to your program or do this with you. I've been inside so much. I just haven't spent much time in nature, and I'm really needing to get back to it." And I kind of nod, and I'm like, "Okay, well, but what about the fact that everything on this planet is nature? Or for that matter, everything in the universe is nature. Yes, we have changed it. Yes, it has modified. Yes, we, have separated ourselves from that. But at a core level, everything is nature, and that includes us. We are of this earth. We are breathing the same air and drinking the same water that our ancestors did 10,000 years ago. We have evolved in deep connection to planet Earth. If we look at from an evolutionary timescale, we have spent at most 1,000, 2,000 years, if we want to look at agriculture, apart, separated from the earth. But that is still, just a blip of time in that, like we've in the grand scale of things, we've spent 99.999% of our time as human beings living in deep connection to the earth. So wouldn't it make sense that, I mean, we can just start physically. We know that plenty of studies have been done that show that we are experience greater physical health, greater emotional health, greater mental health, and yes, greater spiritual health when we connect with the natural world. So that's kind of the starting point, is we are nature. We've evolved to be with nature. So when we return to those roots, when we do shed the walls, when we open up our senses, and sensitize ourselves and listen to the beauty of a creek, babbling creek, and that beautiful, amazing sound of water. When we allow ourselves to feel the pre-cold of pre-dawn, and then the sun rises and our skin takes in that warmth, when we allow ourselves to taste the deliciousness of a wild strawberry and really allow ourselves to become alive in our senses, we return to what it is on the most basic level, to be human. And we all know that we have a sixth sense, that of intuition. One of my teachers and elders used to always say, the quickest path and the deepest path into our sixth sense is through the five senses. And I know there's a lot of people that really are so excited to take the spiritual journey and so excited to tap into intuition and the inner vision. And that's beautiful. And I'm right there with them. But I oftentimes see what's missing is people skip the step of just connecting through the initial five senses and what it is to be a mammal, to be a human being.
Yeah.
But as that happens, Leanne, that brings on board the combination of those five senses. We sensitize ourselves. We pay attention to the quietest sound or pick up the most subtle smell. It's through that our intuition activates. And that might be through our dreams. It might be through feelings. It might be through images coming to us. But nature it's the original proving grounds for us as human beings. So when we return to that, when we return to nature, we return to our deepest nature. And, from a psycho-spiritual perspective, we can see that deep connection with the natural world brings us back to really, I think, the language of nature, or the language of soul, which is image, or which is vision quest. I mean, that term vision quest actually came from the recognition that it is vision, or an image, that is the language of soul. And so to go back to nature and to open ourselves up to not just the images and the metaphors, but the living presence of all of that diversity, of the cycle of life and death that is present in the natural world and is present inside of us, it becomes a grand mirror of sorts, a living mirror of sorts, that literally, with the right intention and with surrender and hopefully some good mentoring, really can reflect our very soul back to us and activate that. And the last thing I'll say is, I've always, I think, intuitively recognized this. I maybe didn't have the language for it I have now 20 years ago. But in the early years of running our school, I was not very explicit about the purpose thing, right? I was just like, hey, come here and we'll teach you how to connect with nature. We'll teach you these old skills. And invariably what we found was that the deeper people went with connecting with nature, invariably the deeper their soul spoke to them. And that was not even intentional for years. There was a natural, organic response of the human spirit when it's immersed in that way and connecting through the senses with intention. It activates the spirit. It activates dreams. It activates those deep yearnings, the deep questions. Why am I here? What am I leaving? What's my responsibility to my children, to future generations? All of that. So those are a few thoughts on your question there.
Wow. I'm so glad I asked you that now. That was gorgeous.
Yeah.
Gosh, there's a few things there that I want to deepen into. I'm just trying to decide between them. And
yeah.
one thing that really, actually, I felt a rush of emotion as you said it was when you're talking about, the air that we breathe and the water we drink is the same as, humans have drunk and breathe for,
Yes.
all the time on the planet. And I was talking to a podcast guest this morning on the topic of synchronicity. He's a psychologist that his background's in kind of Jungian psychology. And obviously that was, Jung's kind of like almost like hidden pet project was around synchronicity.
Yes.
And but the conversation went on to talk about intuition and things like that. And then we were talking about entanglement, from a quantum perspective. And as you said that about, and how he was saying, ultimately it makes sense that we should have these kind of synchronicities, i.e. connections with things that aren't necessarily here in this moment. And as you said that, I was thinking, oh my gosh, yes. And that doesn't just mean here and now, it means going back in time, potentially forward in time too. And I just had such a strong sense of, wow, we have the connection to ourselves, our soul, to the wild, but then to our ancestors, which I kind of just felt at such a deeper level than I had before, as you said it, and with that kind of idea of entanglement, just incredible. So I just wanted to share that because I think
beautiful.
There's something so, this word of connection. I mean, ultimately, if we've my original kind of background was more in sort of ascension spirituality, like non-duality, where you sort of see the kind of complete interconnectedness, like non-separation of everything. But what I think is more and more, the more I've kind of got into this descent path, into the body, into the earth, into the soul, there's something so, again, I just feel such emotion when we're able to see that non-separation happen in this material sense, on this earthly plane.
Exactly. And I think that's so important. What that brings up is that, in our modern experience with vehicles and living in homes and four walls and all of this, that is a reflection of a certain aspect of our psyche that we have constructed. And in many ways, it's a reflection of a worldview that does not recognize the interrelatedness of all things. And so, right, like a house is more than a house, where the way our senses are being patterned day in, day out, moment by moment, impacts the way we perceive the world. So what happens to a human being when their only input, right, is the modern experience and buildings? And as one of my elders used to say, that you wake up on the 14th floor of some high rise and take an elevator down and walk on the cement ground and get in a cab and take that to your work and go up another 12 flights. And all day long, your feet never touch the earth. Right? What happens to a human being when that is the sole source of input is very, very different than what happens to a human being when they are exposed to the natural world in its wild form. Because in nature, of course, everything is interconnected.
Yes.
And and we not just see it and feel it, but it's like our energy literally resonates at that level. And we become that. It influences our brain patterns, our perception, and ultimately our worldview, which allows us to locate ourselves as part of nature as well. And not just to know that intellectually, but to feel it, to know that I am nature and I have a place here. I oftentimes, when I think of purpose, I think of it as, in many ways, more of an ecological thing, Leanne, than a spiritual thing. And what I mean by that is the web of life is everything. It is wholeness. And we have a place in that uniquely. Each of us do. And so the journey, I think, of finding purpose is the journey of finding our place in that interrelated web of life. And so what better way to do that than to soak in the original web of life and soak in the natural world?
Oh, yes. You've called to mind a couple of things. One, the chap who runs marketing for hippies, Todd Hargrave, he talks about, his work so, Tad, his work so saturated into just gorgeous, beautiful things. And I love the way he describes the idea of having a niche is actually another way of saying that is your role in a community. And I thought they're so delightful. They're so grounded in kind of like the stuff you're talking about here. You know, what we're really here for isn't about kind of some disassociated sole purpose. It's actually like how we fit into this.
Yes, exactly.
So I love that. The other thing that came to mind that was when my sense of this is, and you've definitely got far more understanding of this than I have. When we look at Indigenous cultures, so dogs are having fun behind me, throwing cushions at pillow fight.
Speaking about wildness, your two dogs are wrestling on the couch back there.
It's very distracting. When we look at different Indigenous cultures, what I've seen, and this is very secondhand, you know, through books and things like this, is there is this sense of everyone has a purpose, and it is very much about how they then fit into that web, that interconnected ecosystem of not just the people they're with, but the whole that they're with, you know, the place, the animals, everything. But I'd love to hear your sense of that, because that feels to me like us knowing that, like we all are meant to have a place. This isn't, again, we're not just these kind of widgets. Like we are meant to have this role. And in a more Indigenous setting, that would have been recognised and celebrated and us initiated into it. But I'd love to have your sense of that.
Well, sure. Yeah. And it's really important for me to say, you know, when I speak about Indigenous wisdom, I don't speak for any Native American people. I don't speak for Indigenous people. I am a white man. I am not. I don't have Native American blood or anything. And I recognize the sensitivity of that and how important it is to honor their sovereignty. I also recognize how much wisdom, I mean, it is staggering to me, Leanne, how much wisdom is present still in Indigenous culture, despite all the genocide that Indigenous cultures have seen through history. And I'm a firm believer that wisdom has so much to offer us and may be one of the few truly healing, regenerative paths forward for us as humanity. So a big part of my work has been honorably and appropriately, respectfully, you know, working to be a bridge to, okay, well, what can I learn here and how can I respectfully bring that back in a way that makes sense for us as modern people in the year 2020, right? But when we look at an earth-based model of community, we see that soul was front and center. Soul and nature were both front and center in the worldview and the value system of those communities. And that is very much not the case for our modern community and modern culture. We do not place soul and nature at the center. They're very much on the outside. So that being the case, the other piece we have to recognize is that those old cultures were mentoring cultures, right? They didn't send their kids to school, right? They didn't have schools per se, and yet they had a survival imperative to pass on wisdom to the next generation so that their people would live. Of course, they wanted their children to flourish just as much as you and I. And so how did they do that? Well, their school was literally integrated in day-to-day life. And this is the model I sometimes refer to as cultural mentoring or community-based mentoring, that everyone recognized. And this is something even for our listeners, you know, this is something I always strive for, that everyone recognized I need to have my elders or my mentors, my teachers, that are teaching me so I can continue to grow at all times of my life. I need to have my peers, you know, that my brothers or my sisters that I can connect with that are at a similar point in my journey that can empathize with me. And I need to have people younger than me or not as far along on their journey that I can help out. And to imagine being a child growing up in a culture like this, you know, cultures that, another thing I'm really fascinated by is Indigenous language, cultures that literally did not have a language for goodbye and didn't have a word for goodbye, didn't have a word for nature because, you know, goodbye represented separation. I mean, they had a word for see you later or until next time. But there was no goodbye. And
Wow.
interestingly enough, as I said, no word for nature. Well, what's up with that? Well, no word for nature because nature was everything. It was no different. If there was, it would be like saying life or the universe, the world, right? So to grow, it's hard, it's maybe impossible, but maybe the listeners could stretch here to actually imagine what it would be like to grow up in a culture like that and be supported and be loved. And yes, hardships still happen, but be mentored and see everyone around you being mentored and see everyone around you honoring soul. Ceremonial practices where the deepest emotional connection happens on a regular basis, and see your dad cry and see your mom in her power and all of the whole spectrum, to be raised in that setting, of course, and with rites of passages and ceremonies and rituals all integrated, right? Then of course those individuals thrived in their purpose. And so for us today, much of my work really is community-based, Leah. And as much work as I do online, I'm also very, very committed to my local community and the children and the teens and the families living here, because we can begin to recreate some of that. We can begin to say, we're going to hold nature and soul at the center of our culture. And we're going to honor this, and we're going to show up for one another, and we're going to care about one another's kids. And so through that process, we're going to create a larger space, a larger field, community-based field that can hold each individual, that we can each nourish from, and we can each be truly a part of that. And so I think that community-based mentoring is so important to, both the discovery and probably ultimately the expression of, or the embodiment of, purpose in this life.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I answered your question or not.
No, you did.
But,
you really did. Yeah. You gave me more than an answer. I really love that. It was making me think as you were talking, and you said, it can be hard to imagine a way of life that's so different to most of us that have been raised in a kind of more modern Western culture. And it brought to mind a book, The Way of the Human Being. Are you familiar with that? It's
I don't think I know that one. Yeah.
It is set in an Indigenous culture, and it kind of it's very story led and kind of sharing stories from that culture. And it really hit me that it's such a different way of being in the world, which then infuses the way you think, the way you, like you say, the language, everything. It's really hard for us to then kind of like, oh, okay, just imagine that, because it's like the way we were developed.
Yes.
It was completely different. Yeah.
Yes.
But that just came to mind. But I was thinking, and yet ultimately we're all human. And I think us understanding that we still do have a place. It may be a different place for many of us, but the same thing's still true. Like, we do have a reason for being here. We still have a soul. We still have a purpose. And whilst some of that may be too hard for us to imagine, just because, again, we're not equipped to, because we haven't got like almost the neural pathways to be able to do so, still that underlying sense of like, we're here for something is still so.
Yeah. And here's another thought on it. So this is good. So, because by nature, when we, and I might even back up a bit here. So when we think about soul, my definition of soul is like, well, really, it's a paradox to even try to define it. But one way would be to say it's our deepest essence. And by nature, when we connect with our soul, we're connecting with, our soul is where we are interconnected with all things. And so when we locate our identity on our soul rather than our ego, that's when we connect with our purpose, right? So there is a transcending of the ego that actually is necessary in order to make that journey. And nature and mentoring and the old ceremonies are so effective at facilitating this. And so when that happens, we can look back at our life and recognize, as you were saying earlier, Leon, that everything that's happened actually happened for a reason, even and especially all those things that we're not at peace with. And now we enter into the healing journey. And well, what about, now that's a big statement that I just made, and I recognize the gravity of it. Well, what about trauma? What about abuse? How can I possibly say that there is a perfection and a beauty in that too? Well, listen, I've suffered that myself personally. I know the weight of that and the dark night of the soul and the whole bit. But what I can honestly say is, looking back at those experiences, well, can I share one more little story here on this note?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So this was maybe 5 years ago. Well, so the preface to the story is all those moments do have a place in our soul's journey, and they are teachers and there are gifts. And the journey of discovering purpose is the journey of coming to peace with ourselves and claiming the fullness, right? Like on the most simple level, I was talking about this earlier, like my sensitivity, that when I was in 4th grade and I was getting beat up in the locker room at school, I hated being sensitive, but now as a 46-year-old man, I love it. And I use it in my clients, and I help people discover their souls and their purpose through my sensitivity. I couldn't imagine not being a sensitive person. I'm so thankful for it, right? So that's like a simple flip from, it was a curse to, it's a blessing. But there's a more profound flip as well that I believe is a landmark moment on the journey of discovering purpose. And so this story will illustrate that. So this was maybe 5-6 years ago. I was leading a boys' rite of passage in my local community, where we initiate boys and really mark the departure from boyhood and the beginning of becoming a young man. And there's a whole wilderness-based rites of passage that we lead. And we were, as part of it, there's a solo that they experience. And we also use the sweat lodge. And after the solo that they had gone through, we were doing a sweat, which is a traditional earth-based ceremony. And there was one boy in particular who was right up against his early trauma that I knew from mentoring him for several years. I knew that he had not let go of. I knew he was still holding it in his body. And I could tell that it was coming up, and it was right at that point. It was like just right there. It was wanting to come out, but he didn't quite know how to do that. He needed some support. So I encouraged him, and sure enough, he just popped, Leon. And he was a very expressionate, passionate, expressive person. And so he was wailing and crying and had this big cathartic release as he was letting go of all this trauma that he had. And it was really intense, and not all people are really this expressive. I happen to be one. He certainly was. A lot of people, it can be a lot quieter, of course, when this happens. But anyhow, so here he was, and this was kind of right on the edge of my capacity to hold. It was a lot for me to hold. I was there, I was holding space, but it was kind of right on my edge. And so he popped, and then all the other initiates, the other boys, kind of like dominoes, went down. They start crying, and then my staff is kind of freaking out, like, oh my God, what is happening? This is so intense. And the hairs are up on the back of our necks. And I was just kind of calming it. I was like, we got this. We just hold space. We've got this. And I had one of the most powerful spiritual moments of my life there, with my hand on his shoulder, just holding space for him. And his body was shaking somatically. He was releasing this trauma. It was so clear, And I knew I just needed to hold space and it would be fine. And I had this moment, Leanne, where my mind's eye, my imagination, it just went all the way back to when I had experienced my own trauma as a boy. And I felt the connection, more than seeing it, more than understanding it intellectually. I felt in my body that, my God, if I had not gone through that trauma when I was a boy, I would not be able to hold space for this person who I love and care about so much. I could not be doing this if it wasn't for that trauma that I had gone through. And it was mind-boggling. I couldn't believe it. I was like in tears and full of joy all at the same time. I was like, this is stuff I had sworn I would keep in a black box and never tell anyone about. It was my big black secret. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, to actually experience that stuff that I had hated, not just to become at peace with it, but to truly be thankful that those things had happened. Yes, it was still unfortunate. Yes, it was not okay. Nor would I ever wish that on anyone. But I had truly found gratitude for those experiences because it allowed me to help this one other person, move through his. And it was just, talk about all as one, interrelated, one is all. It was just unfathomable. Wow. And so I think this points to something important, which is that on this journey of life, and this journey of discovering purpose, it is about coming to peace with ourselves and facing all those vulnerabilities. And I know how hard that is. But I think, my God, if we don't take this journey, each of us as individuals, and really, because that's the thing, is right on the other side of that, it's two sides of the same coin, right? Our sacred wound, our sacred gift. This is a concept I think that's pretty well understood in certain circles these days. So if we don't go to that vulnerability and face that, and I know how hard that is, but if we don't take that journey, we'll never be able to find our power and our real gifts on the other side of it. And that's, I think, one of the things I want most, for our listeners, for everybody, is that we can, for our world, is that we can make that journey and be supported and find mentors and helpers who can help us take that journey and be there for one another and realize, no, it doesn't mean there's something bad with you or there's something broken. That you're a wonderful, beautiful, whole human being, and there's beauty and light and majesty available to each of us. To each of us. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for sharing that story. I feel, everything. Everything. So kind of gradually coming to the end of our time together. And I'm definitely having you back for another one. I can feel we've only just scratched the surface. One final question is, again, a lot of our listeners aren't going to be, completely new to the things we've been talking about here. Sure. I suspect in somewhere or other, they're kind of somewhere on that path. And yet I'm sure they've heard a deeper invitation in what you've been talking about because of the, again, the profound depths of the work you're doing. I'm sure they've heard something more here for them. What would you suggest would be a kind of, I guess, even a practical next step or a way that they can go deeper into this path?
Absolutely. A very simple practice that is really, really powerful would be the sit spot. And I don't know, maybe you're familiar with this, or you've even had perhaps other guests who've shared this. And I want
to say, I've got, I have years ago, which is actually a funny story in itself. This was like years and years and years ago, and it was a new concept to me. And I misheard him and thought he said Sith spot, in
the Star Wars.
I remember being absolutely bamboozled, thinking, what a strange name. And it was quite far into the conversation before
oh my gosh. That's too funny.
So always
not
now,
the Sith spot. No.
I can never hear the word without thinking about that. But I have my own practice of that, which has been.
Oh, good.
I really want you to. I'm not interrupting you to say don't go there. Just to be clear, it's a long time since I've had someone talk about it since the Sith spot. But
right.
It really has been. I love that you've named that as a kind of really beautiful way to deepen it. Because for me, it has been. The most incredible practice, but continues to be. That's the thing that blows my mind. Mine involves actually a connection with a tree as well. So I've got an oak tree, and so it's a kind of combination of a sit spot and this tree. And it's like every year that goes by, it provides like more gifts, more depths, more just sometimes I go there and what I'm shown, just I'm like, how is that even possible? How is that even possible? But anyway, sorry to say all that, but I had to share the story about the sit spot anyway.
I love
it. But do carry on.
It is, Leanne. It's a very simple and a very powerful practice that builds over time. And it's very, very present when we look at old earth-based cultures. For me, I'll say, I'm such a spiritually driven person. When I first went out, my introduction to the sit spot was I found a mentor and said, heard about this whole vision quest thing and said, okay, I want to do the big vision quest. And his first response to me was, okay, well, the prerequisite is go find a sit spot and go sit there every day, without missing one for an entire year. Rain or shine, go in the dark, go in the light, et cetera, all weathers, all times of day, and just build that relationship and do that for a year and then come back and find me. Well, I did. Now, the story of the vision quest is maybe for a later time, but the sit spot. So the sit spot is a simple place that we adopt, a place in nature. And the way to look at it is it's like building a relationship with another human being, look at nature as a person and say, okay, I want to build a relationship with you. I want to share about me with you, and I want to learn about you. I want to be open to you. I want to have a reciprocal, a give and a take, a relationship. And so, a sit spot is somewhere practical, somewhere that's relatively easy to get to, that's wild. And it doesn't have to be Alaska or the great, some great national park or something. It can be a city park. It can be maybe just your back porch even, but someplace in nature that's easy to get to that you feel drawn towards, right? And there's really no right or wrong, but to imagine that the sit spot's almost like a magnet and that you are like a piece of metal and that it's drawing you towards it. Right. And then it's the basic practice is going there regularly. You don't have to go every day, but a few times a week is great. And if you can only do once a week, then okay, once a week. I always recommend at least 30 minutes, importantly, because it takes about 20 minutes for baseline to resume in the natural world. Meaning when you walk out, someone who's just starting is going to bring a certain amount of disturbance to the experience just through the way they're moving and whatnot. And it takes about 20 minutes for nature to resume. So you go there and you sit still and you just open your senses. What can you smell? What is the quietest sound you can hear? Use your peripheral vision. Don't focus in so hard on things. Take in the big picture. Feel the earth. Be willing to get wet a little bit. It won't kill you. Be willing to go there in the dark. Be willing to go there in the light. As I said, the different times of year, the different times of day, and connect with the place around you. Who are the animals that come by? Who are the birds that come by? What plants and trees are growing there? And what feels connective to you? What feels alive? Where is there energy for you? And look into that, become a bit of a naturalist, just from the very basic perspective, what are these species? How did they go about living in this world? And what is their survival strategy? And what does that have to teach you? Right? All of these are good questions. And I always encourage people to start kind of from that basic sensory approach, as well as kind of that of the naturalist. Start right here in the physical world. And if you're the spiritual type and you're yearning for your purpose and you're yearning for spiritual wisdom, over time, begin to bring those questions and intentions. Okay, this time I'm going to my sit spot and my intention is, maybe at first it's just giving thanks, or maybe at first it's just opening my senses or getting to know and greeting this place. And over time, maybe those intentions become something like, okay, what transition am I in the midst of? What is dying in me? I'm seeing, I'm thinking of the fall right now. It's autumn here in the Northern Hemisphere. So I'm seeing the leaves coming down and I'm wondering, what are the leaves that are falling down off of me? What am I letting go of? What am I preparing a space for in the winter months that are to come? What will the new life be next spring? Begin to look at nature as a mirror for your process and ask those questions. Come out with a strong intention, and be always willing to go out and just surrender and just receive whatever wisdom it is that nature has to give you. And over time, that grows and grows and grows. And synchronicities start unfolding, connections start happening. And eventually that will build and crescendo, ultimately, if a person follows that long enough, to the grand synchronicity of life, which I think really is this concept of vision and purpose. So there's a lot more to say about the sit spot. It's a favorite practice, but that's a great way that people can just get started. Easy. It's right there. And, bonus points if you can find someone else to do it who's doing it as well and come back and share stories with, begin to cultivate that culture and that community that values nature and share those stories. What are your favorite sit spots? Oh my gosh, I'll share you this one about when this coyote came by, or, oh, I've got this one about this beautiful oak tree, as you were saying, and value that and share that and let that build. Those are some really powerful practices, especially over time.
Oh, yeah. Gosh, I'm so lovely. I really, really love that you offered that as a practice. I think it's funny because I look back at some of the things that people recommended years and years ago, and I think it's so hard to imagine how powerful these seemingly quite simple, almost boring practices can be.
Yeah.
And again, over the years, I've realized that, oh my gosh, everything that people said about these practices were like not just true, but my experience actually have like surpassed anything that they'd said.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, if someone's listening and they're not yet in that practice, like it's okay to have skepticism, but like the only way to know for sure is to try it yourself.
Yeah, try it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Amazing. So where can listeners find out more about you and your amazing work?
Well, sure. Thank you. So I have two organizations, I think, as I mentioned earlier. There's Purpose Mountain as well as Twin Eagles Wilderness School. So Purpose Mountain, that's where I work with people very directly around the intention of how can I discover my authentic soul level life purpose. And I use a whole variety of nature-based approaches. That's just purposemountains.com. So www.purposemountain, no spaces or dashes.com. I've got a free little purpose discovery kit. It's some kind of early activities, including a nature-based one to get people out on the land a little bit, and just some accessible activities. It's kind of a workbook of sorts to help make some of those initial connections. So if you're into the whole purpose journey and the whole spiritual journey, check me out there. If your interest is more on the side of just connecting with nature and the wilderness skills and all of that, then folks can check out my wilderness school. That's centered here in Sandpoint, Idaho, USA, where I live. And that's Twin Eagles Wilderness School. So it's www.twineagles.org, O-R-G at the end.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Oh, this has been such a treat. It really has. I feel like I've just kind of just saturated in some just real yummy experience. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
It's been really, really rich, and you're sure welcome. And really, it's a real honor for me, Leanne. I sure appreciate the opportunity to share my message here on your podcast.
Oh, honestly, my pleasure. Thank you. What a gorgeous show. So many takeaways. Here are my favorites. Life isn't random. We're all here for a reason. We all have a purpose within our setting. It's just how things work. The wild provides such a potent portal to revealing our purpose because we are of this earth. When we spend time in nature, resensitize and connect to the wild, we return to what it is to be human. We connect to our souls, and our sixth sense, our intuition, comes alive. Our own trauma can hold the medicine for others. Seeing that can bring a greater depth of connection and meaning to our lives. Lastly, I love Tim's suggestion of starting by finding a sit spot in nature. It really has been one of my most transformative practices. I can wholeheartedly recommend it. If you'd like to get the notes and links for everything we spoke about this week, hop on over to the show notes, and they're at primalhappiness.co/episode 304. And if you don't want to miss out on next week's episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Stitcher, or your Android or iOS app of choice and hit subscribe. That way you'll get each episode straight to your device as soon as it's released. Thank you so much for listening. You've been wonderful. Catch you again next Tuesday.